I hope nobody's eating dinner right now. It's a pretty gross picture I'm giving.
Yeah. Enjoy your breakfast. Well, hello there, and welcome to the Bible Geeks Weekly Podcast. This is episode 73. I'm Brian Sheely.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. Today's episode, we're picking up right where we left off on the last one, getting into Matthew chapters 19 through 23. And you said something 2 episodes ago that I want to key off of here on this episode. You had mentioned that too often there's a little bit of Pharisee in you. And I would definitely agree with that with myself. And so now that we've come to Matthew 23 here, this chapter is all about the Pharisees and Jesus' condemnation of them, his criticism of them. It's heavy. And so figure, let's go deep and share some of our thoughts on some of Jesus' greatest adversaries, I guess you could call them.
Yeah, the problems that Jesus points out about the Pharisees are problems that just have a way of showing up among religious people. And these were a lot of hypocrites among the Pharisees, of course, and maybe a culture that tended to foster some hypocrisy in different ways. But it's not like every Pharisee was bad. These were people who took the Bible seriously, but they so often got it so wrong in spite of their seriousness about their religion. And look around and look within, more importantly, and you can see it. I heard somebody say the church can be the second coming of the Pharisees if we're not careful.
I would say that's pretty accurate. So let's get into that in a little bit. Before we do, though, let's find Jesus here in week 31 of the End of the Book Bible Reading Program, Matthew 19 through 23. So where do you find Jesus here in these chapters?
I find Jesus riddling about his own identity with the Pharisees. So this is the passage right before the woes to the Pharisees in Matthew 23. And my kids are into riddles right now, kind of the when is a door not a door kind of thing. And they think that they can just make up a riddle. But they love the ones they've heard and they like to retell them, but then they try to make one up, and I'll try to make up riddles with them, and it's amazing how hard it is to make up a riddle on the spot. But here Jesus poses kind of an interpretive riddle that shows that the Pharisees' thinking about the Messiah is missing that key aha idea that would make it all make sense, like when you get a riddle. And so I'll read it and then we'll talk about it. It says in Matthew chapter 22, verses 41 to 46, "Now when the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, 'What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?' And they said to him, 'The son of David.' He said to them, 'How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet? If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son?' And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions." I love that ending. And nobody asked him anything ever again.
Oh, don't even dare. Don't you dare.
Don't you dare. So Jesus asked this question that seems really simple on the surface. You've read so much about the Messiah, scribes and Pharisees. You're the experts. So tell me something easy. Whose son is he? Obviously, he's David's son. Everybody knows that.
Right.
But then why does David call him Lord? Such a powerful, simple question. It's like a home run. It's like a three-pointer at the buzzer. It's just like the perfect ending to this whole game that they're trying to bring with their gamesmanship of trying to trap him. And it's the end. It's over whenever he asks this question. And so he's quoting an important psalm for Christians, Psalm 110. This is the one that says, I'll make you a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. But it starts with this idea of David, who, according to the title, and more importantly, according to Jesus, wrote the psalm. David says he's talking about the Lord Yahweh said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. And so how can he be the son of David and not the son of David? Whose son is he? When is a door not a door? How does this work, right? How can he be the son of David and yet be greater than David, and David call him Lord, and be something so much more than the son of David? And they would talk about the heirs, the kings that came from David's line, as a son of God from 2 Samuel 7, that sense of adoption and sonship. But what Matthew has shown us from the beginning of this book is really how Jesus could be the son of David and yet something way more than just a son of David, how he could be the divine Son of God.
I love that Jesus puts a stamp at the end of these really back and forth trials and tests that he's being put through. And he puts this perfect period ending, laying the smack down at the end of it. Never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line. Princess Bride quote, right?
Right.
He just handles it so perfectly. And there's no outsmarting Jesus here, knowing exactly what to say to kind of get them to just be quiet completely. And then he launches into the section that we're going to talk about in a little bit with these woes that he offers.
Yeah, this is part of kind of a couplet of exchanges that I'm going to talk about the other one in a minute. The one that came right before this is them trying to test him about the Greatest Commandment. And in both of these, he gives such simple answers and answers you can't question. These are scriptures and yet they're so piercing and so challenging. They make you, it's like what we talked about before. It's those seeds that are planted or the piece of dust in the oyster that just irritates you until it becomes a pearl. And that's how Jesus teaches. So amazing.
So I found Jesus killing trees. I don't know how else to talk about that. Earlier in the week in Matthew 21, verses 18 to 19, we see a really strange story about Jesus.
Yeah.
It says, in the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. Huh? I scratch my head every time I read this story, and you go to the account that Mark left us, and he gives a little bit more detail, but not much. In his account, it's slightly different. He says that it wasn't even the season for figs, which is, okay, even stranger that Jesus would be looking for figs out of season. But in his account, too, Jesus sees the tree, talks to it on the way to the temple, and then on the way back from the temple, after he kicked basically everybody out of the temple who was selling stuff, then they see the tree again on the way back, and it's withered and died at that point. So Mark's account, Matthew's account, just slightly different by a little bit, but even putting those two together, you have to wonder, what on earth is going on here? What is this all about? And I think it's very closely tied to what happens in the temple, because here in Matthew's account, right before this happens, that's when Jesus had gone into the temple and he cleansed it. He flipped over the tables, kicked out the money changers and everything like that. And then right after that, on the way back home, that's when this happens with this fig tree in Matthew's account. And I think there's a tie-in with these two things together. And I think the tie-in is that Jesus has expectations. He expects things to serve their function. And I think really he expects people to serve their function. And if the purpose of the temple was for worship and the purpose of this tree is for fruit, when the temple isn't serving its purpose and the tree isn't serving its purpose, then it's time for some consequences. I think Jesus here is showing in a small way what he did in the temple in a big way by essentially, saying, look, you're not serving your function. You need correction.
Yeah, and I think you're right on point. I think you've got, as far as interpreting this, and that's how I see it, I think it's part of this set of 3 sign acts. The prophets often did these actions that spoke louder than words. And Jesus, first, he comes in on the donkey. He's coming in as the new king. The king is here that should be the rightful king of Jerusalem. And then, like you say, the temple and cleansing the temple, that's not just about money changers. That's about something bigger, which we won't go into completely here, but it's an act of judgment on Jerusalem and on the temple and on the religious leaders and what Israel is meant to be. And Israel is often pictured as a fig tree or as a plant or as a vine or a vineyard throughout the prophets. And there's this sense of judgment that Jesus has, like you say, that it's not doing what it's meant to do. And then the question comes to us, if Jesus came, and the first time he came, he didn't find God's people doing what they were meant to do and being what they were meant to be. What will he find when he comes again? When the Son of Man comes again, will he find faith on earth? Are we bearing fruit? Are we bringing the light to the world as we're meant to?
I think you said it much better than I could have. So let's carry on. That was good. To our next segment, which is Scripture du jour.
What is the soup du jour?
It's the soup of the day.
That sounds good. I'll have that.
So we're in Matthew 22 today, and what do you find from this chapter? There's a good bit here, and you've already touched on a little bit of insight for our day-to-day life.
Absolutely. Well, I tried not to, again, outsmart myself by trying to go too obscure. The greatest commandment ever made is right here in this chapter. So Jesus is asked again by the Pharisees. They come up to him. They send one of their own to represent them. And it says, asked him a question to test him. And so this is one of the experts in the law. And he says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets."
Hey, there's the law and the prophets again.
There it is. Matthew 22, 34 to 40 is where that's found. Yeah, exactly. Jesus keeps coming back to this idea that the law and the prophets are the ones that testify to him, that he's not just throwing out the law and the prophets. He actually holds them in the highest esteem of anybody. But he says you can just boil it down, and here's the essence of all the law and all the prophets, these two commandments. And Scott McKnight, a writer that I think often has something interesting to say about a lot of the teaching that Jesus brings. He calls this the Jesus Creed. And there's a book called The Jesus Creed that he wrote, and he suggests reciting this statement of Jesus daily, just like Jews in Jesus' time and today recited Deuteronomy 6, 4-5, which Jesus quotes here. And in Mark 15, he actually quotes the whole thing. He's asked about the commandments, and he starts out, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind." And then Jesus does something kind of special. He brings another right alongside it, another one that has this same beginning, "You shall love," only it's this love of neighbor, Leviticus 19:18, love of neighbor as yourself. And it's this two-part framework that really, if you pay attention, not just in Matthew, but in all of Jesus' teaching, and not surprisingly, in all of the New Testament and all of the Bible, but especially as you look at Jesus' teaching, you see this breakdown. Everything kind of flows into this two-part outline really beautifully. You can break the Beatitudes down into this. You can break the Lord's Prayer into this two-part idea of loving God and loving others. And if you put these two together, you have everything you need to know. The rest is just getting the details down. But if you can orient yourself, align your heart to constantly come back to working on that, you're going to be learning everything else you need to learn, because that's what love of God and love of neighbor leads you to do. The idea is, if you're loving God with all your heart and loving your neighbor as yourself, then you're going to get all the rest of these details and set them in proper priority under it. So I just think it's really amazing how throughout Matthew, just like the Sermon on the Mount, we've talked about Jesus is this master teacher, and Matthew is his spirit-led biographer extraordinaire, who together they give us these memorable short bits of teaching that we can memorize, we can reflect on while we go through our day. And really, if you take these two commandments, our prayers should start with devotion to God. Hallowed be your name, your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, and then move on to our commitment to others, praying for others and forgive others their debts. May we forgive others their debts, and you forgive us of our debts. And we can turn to others and ask for these kinds of things. These are commandments the Pharisees knew. They had them memorized. They could talk at lengths about, but though Jesus isn't giving them something new, these are the opposite of the woeful picture he gives as we go in now from this commandment and that last bit. We're going into Matthew 23, and in these commandments, we find the antidote to our hypocrisy and our hardness and our destructive attitude towards others and all the things the Pharisees, and if we're honest, sometimes we have problems with. Just keep coming back to the 2 commandments.
I wonder, because they proposed this to Jesus as a test, I wonder what they were expecting him to say. And it doesn't really say. There's not a lot of going back to see their reaction after he says this, but you have to wonder what they were expecting him to say, like what he was going to highlight that they were going to jump on. But obviously they can't jump on or attack anything that he says here. These, you boil it down. These are absolutely the 2 tent poles of being right with God, fearing him and loving others. It's all about that.
It's so simple. Like I said, they can't argue with it. And yet, wow, sit with it and think about how important this is and how this could change us if we start living it.
Yeah. Well, back in the beginning here of chapter 22, Jesus tells a fairly lengthy parable, and I won't read the whole thing because that would just take a while, but he's telling this parable of the wedding feast, and this is a slightly different version of the wedding feast parable that he tells in the other Gospels. But here, he tells this parable in response basically to these Pharisees who had been testing him and who were giving him a hard time. And so he opens it up and says, look, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a feast for his son. Now, I wonder who the king and who the son are here in this parable. But you go on and you find that a lot of people rejected the invitation, and eventually, the king gets angry and he goes out and sends people to anyone they could find in the streets to invite everyone in as guests. And whoever showed up, it says specifically, the good and the bad came along. And so we see this full wedding feast now, full of all the kind of rejects or the leftover people who weren't initially invited. But in verse 11, but when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And here's what I latched onto in this reading, verse 14. "For many are called, but few are chosen." Obviously, he's talking about the Pharisees there, that they were called and they rejected him. Few are chosen, though. And it seems almost unfair to invite all of these other people, and they do show up, and then to have another standard on them that you have to be wearing a certain kind of proper attire or a certain kind of clothing to be able to stay there at the wedding feast. But I guess it just got me thinking about, how can I be called but not chosen? Here, this one, whoever this was, shows up at the feast. He at least answers the call and shows up, but that's not enough. Showing up isn't enough. Obviously, you have the people who rejected the invitation in the beginning, but even for those who showed up, there was still a standard. There was still a requirement that they had to fulfill, and that was to wear this certain attire. I think Paul says in Romans 13, verse 14, "But put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires." It kind of seems to fit here into this picture of clothing and proper attire. Putting on Jesus and making sure that we're not keeping fleshly desires around to gratify ourselves with. But to be chosen here, I think, is all about meeting the standards to fit the occasion.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think of all of this. Is this parable is the commentary on what it means that many are called, but few are chosen.
Yeah.
So then what does this story tell us? Well, Jesus is having them bring in anybody they can find. I mean, the people are rejecting the feast. People don't want to be there. So he's saying, bring in the scoundrels, bring in anybody. I'm not being discerning about who I'm inviting. Everybody, come on in. But that doesn't mean that he is allowing people to disrespect him at the feast. Right. He's throwing a party. He's invited you to come. Now it's on you to not only decide to accept the invitation, but like you're saying you could accept the invitation and still not be, according to the way this story tells it, not be chosen.
Right.
Not be one of the ones that makes it through the end of the feast. You could be kicked out of the feast before it's over.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into our last segment, which is Deep Thoughts.
And now, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy.
So we're talking Matthew 23. We figured we might as well have some deep thoughts on the Pharisees. Let's go back and forth and talk about some things. I guess before we get to Matthew 23, let's go to Matthew 22. And I was thinking here, flattery gets you nowhere. That's my first deep thought. It seems like the Pharisees are really good at flattering Jesus. Well, maybe not really good because he calls them out on the carpet for it right away. It says in Matthew 22, verse 15, "Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words, and they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, 'Teacher, we know that you are true.'" I can't read this without making fun of them and reading it. It's so sarcastic. "Teacher,
Yeah.
we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?"
We read back in chapter 15 that they were already plotting to kill him.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites?" And as much as I give them a hard time, I can't even tell you how many times I've done this. I've buttered people up, saying things that were flattering, but things that I didn't really mean, and inwardly feeling sense of frustration and maybe even anger towards those people. I don't know if you've done this. I'm sure you have.
Never.
Never.
You're alone on this, man. No, I'm joking.
This is all on you, brother.
Yeah.
And sometimes not even to people's face, but sometimes in an environment where you're gossiping about somebody, telling facts about somebody to someone else, all the while painting them as like this, "Oh, I really love them. I really care about them." As at the same time, I'm cutting them down with my words and what I'm saying. It's just so disingenuous here. And Jesus doesn't even put up with it a little bit. He knows it right away. He knows what's going on. "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites?" Just calls them right out for it. And his later woes in chapter 23 about them being clean cups and whitewashed tombs, all the while there's dirt and death under the surface, that just really hits home with me sometimes. And we talked about it on episode 71 when you were talking about from Matthew chapter 12 about the tree and its fruits and having to do heart work, really letting our words kind of inform what kind of heart work we really need to do. That sense of genuineness and sincerity really just has to take hold in my life if I want to be the kind of person that really is unlike the Pharisees, which I should kind of want to do in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Adrian tells a story sometimes about a time that she was at the cabin back before I started coming with them to the cabin, and she put some hot chocolate or something in a cup and then looked down and it was just full of like maggots and bugs and grossness, and it looked clean on the outside, but somehow, they go away from the cabin for a year and then they come back and who knows who had taken care of it the last time it was there, and it was just like, I'm never drinking anything again, that you just look down at this absolute cup of disgustingness, and yet on the outside looks like, yeah, I could go for a nice warm cup of hot cocoa. And that's the idea, I think, of this, the cleaning the cups on the outside, but not on the inside.
Right.
And the whitewashed tombs, it's just, I appreciate the idea that you talked about of really this separation. It's like you become two selves.
Sure.
I mean, you didn't say it that way, but you used the word disingenuous.
Yeah.
And that's really the Pharisee. Sometimes the Pharisees become a caricature as those people, as you said. And when we use this term Pharisaical, they would never even identify or know what we were talking about. Because when we're talking about being Pharisaical, we're thinking about this idea of being split so that your outer world and your inner world don't match. And it is easy. It is easy for me sometimes to have even with my family to be angry and not have kind of done the heart work, as you say, worked it out to have the right kind of grace in my heart. And yet I don't want the conflict, so I just deal with it and I try to put on a happy face. And I'm not saying that I should just let everything out, but I need to work on that inner person to be able to have that not have a cup full of maggots while it's beautiful on the outside. So I hope nobody's eating dinner right now. It's a pretty gross picture I'm giving.
Yeah, enjoy your breakfast. No, I think it just ties in too with the two greatest commandments. You keep telling yourself, you keep reminding yourself to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And eventually, hopefully, that is going to take root and come out of your life, come out in terms of fruit. But it is so easy to be two-faced and hypocritical, as Jesus calls them out to be. And I know I've been in that situation, so I can't really give them too hard of a time.
Yeah, well, that really ties in with what I was thinking for my first deep thought, which at its heart is this idea that Jesus wants us to be whole. Mm-hmm. But putting that in its context, I think it's easy to see the Pharisees as overzealous for the law. They're sticklers who just take the commandments too seriously. But as you read the Gospel of Matthew, you learn that actually Jesus is more of a stickler for the commandments than the Pharisees. But again, the difference is Jesus wants us to be whole in our service to God. And I think that's a really good word, as I'll try to describe why I choose that word. But to have this, not the divided self, but a whole person that is living the kind of life that the Pharisees might look like they're living, or we might look like we're living as we do some things right. And it's not even just about external versus internal, but that is a really critical part of it. But a couple of verses that come to mind with this idea of Jesus taking the law so seriously and yet meaning it to be a whole person kind of righteousness. He says in Matthew 5 verse 20 in the Sermon on the Mount, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." You need to be more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees. And if we're thinking, yeah, but they're awful people, you got to remember that the people that he's talking to hear this and they know that the scribes and Pharisees are the most religious people they've ever met. People who have memorized their Bibles, who have taken it on, and who are living these rituals so in extreme acts of righteousness. But he goes on from there in the next two parts of the sermon to explain what that means. So he says at the end of chapter 5, you must be whole, or sometimes the translations we have usually say, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. But that's really intimidating. I don't think that's actually the best translation. The word is teleos, which means to be whole or to be complete. Sometimes it's translated mature, but it's not about you must be sinless, you must have never done anything ever in life. It's about being whole. And he shows what that looks like in those 6 antitheses we were talking about that come right before this, where he says, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I say you don't be angry. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say don't lust. This whole person that goes to your very heart needs to be following this kind of righteousness. And then the next part in chapter 6, he says, whenever you pray, go in the closet. Whenever you fast, let it be about the thing that it needs to be about and not as a show for people. When you give alms and all of those kinds of things, make it about serving the Lord. And in the woes here, he says in Matthew 23:23, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law. So does he say you don't need to tithe every little sprig of plant in your garden? Actually, he says, these you ought to have done. It's good. You should do that. You should take the law seriously without neglecting the others, without neglecting justice and mercy and faithfulness. And of course, we're not under some of those specific laws that they were under. We're following the law by following Christ and how he shows us the fulfillment of the law. But he takes this very serious, takes obedience more seriously than the Pharisees. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, outwardly, they looked very religious, and they worked very hard to look very religious, but he's pointing out the piece that they're missing, which is really the heart piece. And without the heart piece, and without a full, broad, holistic view of what God wants us to do, then like you said, we're not going to be whole. We're going to be incomplete. We're going to be imperfect.
Yeah. Whenever righteousness becomes political, which it can so easily whenever it's this culture of expectations of here's what it looks like, and are you sound? You need to look sound. You make sure. And now I'm questioning whether you're sound, so I'm going to look for anything that looks different, making sure everyone knows you did what you were supposed to do. And it's easy for me to start to feel this need to have the right sheen on things and make sure that that everything is waxed and buffed so that there's that nice shine on it, when really that can be distracting really from the things that are important. One of the things that starts to show up whenever we do that, besides this external performance, is traditions.
Oh, yeah.
And the way it used to be and the way we've always done it. I heard, what was it? N.T. Wright was talking about one of these passages about the Pharisees, and he told a joke. He said, how many Anglicans does it take to change a light bulb? And he's an Anglican bishop. And so he asked, how many Anglicans does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is 5. 1 to change it, and 4 to talk about how good the old light bulb used to be. and I love that because we can, I can go all the way on that. I can get in there with anybody and talk about how good things used to be and not wanting to change traditions. And I think a lot of the congregations I've been part of, there's just this fondness for the way not only we do it, the way our parents did it, the way our grandparents did it, and also the way all the other groups in all the different parts of the country that we consider to be sound, how they do it. And I'm not talking about the things that Jesus commanded, but all of the other traditions. And so the Pharisees and scribes had these traditions. And in Matthew 15, they come to Jesus and they ask, why don't your disciples follow the tradition of the elders? And Jesus doesn't say, I'm bringing something newer and you're stuck in old things with these old traditions. He actually goes back to something older than their traditions, which is the actual standard, God's word. And the problem wasn't that they didn't have enough guardrails and strict applications of God's rules. It was that they didn't let it pierce their hearts. Sometimes we try to put God's commandments in neat boxes and file them away and try to make sure we have everything figured out and applied in just the right way. But when they didn't take these and let them be something that's piercing them and they're thinking through, and when we don't reflect on them and bring a continual openness and beginner's mind and a hunger for God and a worshipful attitude as we approach the Word, we can start to just get kind of a crusty outer shell that is keeping us from the vitality and life that the Word actually was meant to bring when we take it seriously and say, I hold on to these commandments and I will follow them to the utmost.
I like that, crusty outer shell.
So that's my first deep thought.
Yeah.
What is your deep thought number 2?
My second deep thought is those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So when we see here in Matthew 23, nearing the end of Jesus' woes that he ascribes to them, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourself that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell?" I think we do this. I do this. The Pharisees, they looked back and they put themselves into the shoes of those who had persecuted the prophets, and they said, we would never have done that. You know, they hold up the Elijah, they hold up Elisha, they hold up all these prophets from long ago. And they said, we would never have treated them poorly. Yet, what are they about to do? What are they currently doing to Jesus? And what are they going to do here very shortly to Jesus? They're going to do the exact same things that they say they would never do. And I think we can do that when looking back to the Pharisees. We can look back to the Pharisees right now. We could sit here and we could say, I would never be like the Pharisees. Yet, if we had lived back there in that time, would we have really done it differently? would we have not been like the angry mob shouting, crucify him, crucify him? I mean, there were very few people who were not influenced to do and follow the persecution that the Pharisees were promoting and pushing. I don't know. I mean, I could say I would have done it differently, but I feel kind of like in a meta way that I'm probably being like the Pharisees in saying that. I don't know how I would have reacted any differently than the Pharisees did. But if I'm looking back to them and learning from them and learning from their poor choices, hopefully I would make a different decision now. And I guess the question is, am I, like we've been talking about here, am I holistic? Am I really changed and sincere from my heart, loving my neighbor as myself? Is that my ultimate goal? Loving the Lord my God, loving my neighbor as myself. Do those things drive me to do things differently? Or would I have been just like the Pharisees if I'd had been back there then?
That's a helpful question. I like that phrase you used, holistic obedience, holistic discipleship. And the question, am I becoming the person I said I'd never become? Am I that guy? Am I that Pharisee or that children of Israel? It's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so my second deep thought is beware of evangelizing and making copies of yourself. So one of the things that having kids is interesting because you start to realize how much your kids are like you in ways that you love and ways that you don't. There's a Ben Folds song that says, "And you're so much like me, I'm sorry."
It is frightening.
It is. And one of the things that the Pharisees were doing is making copies of themselves, and we need to watch ourselves, and there's some dangers in that. So in Matthew 23, verses 13 and 15, Jesus says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." Wow. So you might think, shouldn't they be praised for their evangelistic zeal?
Oh, they're doing the work.
They're doing the work. They're getting out there. They have a heart for evangelism, you might say. And don't we wish more of us had a zeal to travel across sea and land to make a single convert? But if my goal is to make someone who believes and thinks and acts just like me, I better watch I'm not making a disciple of Ryan.
Yeah.
Right? And I see two problems behind this. The first is that lack of log in my own eye, humble work that we keep talking about.
Right.
If we aren't constantly examining ourselves and putting that first, we can be the greatest evangelizers in the world, but we're in danger of evangelizing the wrong thing and modeling the wrong things and teaching the wrong things.
Be imitators of me as I am of Christ.
Amen.
If you don't have that last part, you're in big trouble, man.
Yeah, you really are. So then number two is, the other problem I see in this is the difference between indoctrination versus discipleship. Mm-hmm. That is trying to instill a creed or a set of beliefs that you believe versus teaching people to follow Jesus and to learn from Jesus and to, as we talk about sometimes in Acts 17 and 1 Thessalonians 5, to examine everything and to see if these things are so. And so you're setting people on a course to grow and thrive in Christ, the teach them to fish kind of model. And I think that it's one thing to indoctrinate your kids whenever they're 3 years old. That makes a lot of sense to me. But if we're not teaching them, I think this is maybe part of where a lot of young people in the church have gone astray because we haven't really discipled them. We haven't taught them to look to Christ and to learn with Him as their teacher. We've just given them our list, like making sure that their cheat sheet of beliefs matches ours line by line and check by check. And so I guess the idea is personal devotion must always come before instilling a love for Christ in others, or we'll start to miss that instilling a love for Christ in others is the point, not making somebody match my ideas and practices, because I'm still figuring it out. And I do want to teach them what I know. And I'm not saying there's none of that, but first and foremost, it's pointing them to a person and to a God.
That is deep, man. We could talk about that for a long time. I think there have been so many people over the years who have been unfortunately impacted by the lack of this kind of thoughtfulness in evangelism. Really, it's not about agreeing with me. It's not about following all the same, we do this, we don't do that, we don't do this other thing, kinds of traditional teachings that so many people have heard throughout the years. It's about getting back into a relationship, into a deep love and commitment with Christ. Like, that is number one, the first thing. And it's not about me. It's not about my traditions. It's not about what I believe. I guess if we're going to get anything out of this episode, we've just got to be the whole package. And we've got to be making copies of the whole package, not just copies of part or pieces or insincere little bits and baubles of what's real.
Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into the challenge here as we close this thing out.
Well, I think it's simple and obvious, but we just are challenging ourselves and everyone to identify that little bit of Pharisee in you. If there is some part of you, as you examine yourself in light of the things Jesus says to challenge the Pharisees, look for it. See what is there in you that needs to have some heart work done, and take a step to correct it.
Yeah. I don't know who can look at Matthew 23 and not see themselves in there somewhere. I think every one of us can look into that chapter and just really go, oh, that steps on my toes. We've talked about some of our issues with it personally, but we probably all have it. So, I love that challenge. I'll be doing it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and isn't that the point? I mean, this wasn't written for the Pharisees. This was written for disciples to see and watch out for that kind of thing creeping in.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website at BibleGeeks.fm. You can find show notes for this episode in your podcast player of choice or at BibleGeeks.fm/73. You can follow along with our Into the Book Bible reading program. We'll be in week 32 next week, so follow along with us there. That's at BibleGeeks.fm/into the book. And if you want to contact us, we would love to talk to you. Reach out to us at BibleGeeks.fm/contact. And until next week, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.